I want to start with the part that sounds the least alarming, because I think that's important. The beginning of this wasn't strange. It was paperwork. It was a spreadsheet on a Tuesday afternoon in October, a cup of coffee that had gone cold without my noticing, and a closure notation in an incident log that I probably should have scrolled past and didn't. That's the whole origin of this. That's what 8 months of something I can't fully name started as a Tuesday, a cold coffee, a code at the end of a row that read, "Unable to locate subject." I work in transportation data analysis. Have for about 11 years. The job is what it sounds like. I pull infrastructure data for highway corridors, cross-reference incident logs, traffic flow metrics, maintenance records, and I write assessment reports for regional planning firms and state transportation offices. It is a job that other people find dull when I try to explain it, and most of the time they're right. I sit with spreadsheets. I look for anomalies in flow data. I flag things that warrant closer review. Most things don't warrant closer review. Most anomalies are sensor errors or road closures or a stretch of bad weather. The data doesn't usually mean anything beyond what it says. That's the professional context. I want it on the record, because what I'm about to describe is going to sound, at certain points, like the kind of thing that requires a disclaimer about the mental state of the person saying it. So I'm putting the disclaimer here. I'm aware of how pattern recognition works and how it can fail. I'm aware that apophenia, seeing connection in noise, is a function the brain performs automatically and often incorrectly. I've thought about that constantly. It hasn't resolved the problem, which is why I'm still writing about it. In October of 2022, I was working on a corridor assessment for a section of US Route 83 in Nebraska, specifically the stretch between North Platte and Valentine, which is about 110 miles of two-lane highway through the Sandhills. If you've never been to the Sandhills, they are exactly what the name suggests. Rolling grass hills, sparse trees, very wide sky, almost no traffic infrastructure. You can drive 40 miles on Route 83 through the Sandhills without passing a gas station. Cellular coverage ranges from poor to non-existent depending on the elevation and the carrier. It's the kind of road that exists to connect specific places to other specific places, not to be driven for its own sake. If you're on it because you need to be somewhere. My job that week was to reconcile traffic volume data with a maintenance schedule, which required me to cross-reference an incident log. The incident log is a secondary document. It's not technically part of my standard deliverable, but I use it to explain flow dips that otherwise read like sensor failures. An accident closes one lane for 3 hours. Your flow numbers look weird for that window. The incident log explains it. Standard practice. I've been doing it for years. The Nebraska incident log for that corridor covered January 2018 through September 2021. It was a long document, about 2,000 rows, covering everything from maintenance flags to weather events to reported accidents to welfare check initiations. Welfare checks are when someone calls a non-emergency line about an abandoned vehicle, or a person who failed to arrive somewhere, or something a driver saw on the road that seemed off. They happen on every highway. They're not unusual. What I noticed, after spending about 4 hours in that log, was that 7 welfare check initiations in the window between March 2019 and September 2021 had been closed with the notation "unable to locate subject," not resolved, not subject located. Unable to locate subject. I noted it. I told myself it was probably a records transfer artifact. Some counties use that notation as a default when a case is kicked to a higher authority and the local record gets closed without a proper follow-up code. I moved on. I submitted my report and I didn't think about it for 3 weeks. Then a colleague went on maternity leave and I picked up part of her caseload, which included the Kansas segment of Route 83, running from Dodge City to Liberal in the southwest corner of the state. Different state, different log system, different managing counties. I was in that incident log for about 2 days when I found 4 welfare check closures with the same notation. Same language, different document, different state, different counties entirely. 2 states, 2 incident log systems, 11 cases. 2 incident log systems, 11 cases. Same closure code, same highway. I want to explain what I mean when I say the same highway, because I think it's easy to underestimate how unusual it is for a single route to keep appearing across multiple independent administrative systems. Route 83 runs approximately 850 miles north to south, through the center of the country, North Dakota, Texas, through the geographic middle. It is not an interstate. It is not particularly well traveled compared to corridors like I-80 or I-70. It exists in the spaces between more prominent infrastructure, and the administrative systems that manage it in different states barely communicate with each other. They don't share incident log formats. They don't use standardized closure codes. For the same language to appear across those systems is not statistically expected. And then I pulled the Oklahoma segment for an adjacent project in December of that year, and I found 3 more. And that's when I stopped telling myself it was a records artifact and started wondering what it actually was. So I made a mistake, or the thing that set everything else in motion depending on how you look at it. I spent a weekend in January of 2023 trying to match welfare check closures from those 3 incident logs to actual missing persons cases in public databases. NAMAS, the Doe Network, County Sheriff, press releases, Facebook memorial pages. This is not what I'm paid to do. This is not what I have any training in. I want to be honest about that. But the exercise was just supposed to confirm that the cases had been transferred and lobbed elsewhere, and I was going to satisfy myself that the record's routing was the explanation and let it go. What I found instead was Dale Purcell, 53 years old, former equipment operator. He lived in Rapid City, South Dakota, and he was driving south on Route 83 to visit his daughter in Kearney, Nebraska in June of 2020. His daughter called the non-emergency line when he was 6 hours past his expected arrival and not answering his phone. A Nebraska State Patrol trooper found his truck on the west shoulder of Route 83, approximately 22 miles north of North Platte, pulled over near a gravel access road that led out to a pivot irrigation rig, about half a mile east of the highway. The truck was a 2014 Chevy Silverado, gray, Nebraska plates. The engine was off. The keys were in the ignition. His wallet was on the front seat. His phone was on the front seat. His jacket was on the front seat. There was a thermos of coffee in the cuff holder. The trooper's note said the coffee in the cuff holder. The trooper's note said the coffee was still warm. I read that detail, the warm coffee, and I stopped. I read it again. The internal clock of that detail is very specific. A thermos keeps coffee warm for a certain number of hours, but not indefinitely. And by the time you account for the drive from Rapid City to that point on the highway, plus however long the truck sat there before the trooper arrived, the window for the coffee to still be warm is narrow. Very narrow. Narrow enough that whatever happened had happened recently. Recently enough that the thermos hadn't finished cooling. And whatever happened was thorough enough that Dale Purcell was nowhere near his truck and had left his phone and his wallet behind. He had not been found as of January 2023 when I was reading his file. 2.5 years. His daughter had maintained a Facebook page for him since the month he disappeared. The most recent post she had made was from the previous Thanksgiving. It said she was setting a place for him and that she hoped somewhere, somehow, he knew that. I'm putting that detail in here not for sentiment. I'm putting it in because it's important to stay connected to the fact that these are specific people, not data points, and because the Facebook page is part of how I found the second case, which is the one that changed the texture of what I was looking at. It was in the comments of one of Sandra Christ's posts. Sandra Christ was the wife of a man who disappeared on Route 83 in September of 2021, which I'll come back to that I first encountered the name Brooke Nieminen. Brooke Nieminen was 19 years old and a sophomore at Chadron State College in the northwestern corner of Nebraska. She disappeared in August of 2019. Her roommate described her as someone who drove on weekends sometimes, just to clear her head, no specific destination, just the road. She drove a 2016 Hyundai Elantra, dark blue, Nebraska plates. She left campus on a Tuesday afternoon. Her car was found on Route 83, approximately 12 miles south of the South Dakota state line, on the west shoulder. The engine was running. The driver's door was open, not ajar. The engine was running. The driver's door was open, not ajar. Her phone was inside. Her keys were inside. Her backpack was on the back seat. A cup of iced coffee from a gas station in Chadron, which was roughly 90 miles north of where the car was found, was in the cuff holder. The first responder's note said the coffee was still cold. Still cold. An hour and a half of driving at minimum from where she'd bought it, and the coffee was still cold. An open door. Running engine. Iced coffee still cold. And then nothing. No trace. No witnesses who reported seeing her outside the vehicle. The road behind her was 90 miles of sparse highway through the sandhills. And the road ahead of her was more of the same. And somewhere in that landscape she stepped out of her car, or was taken out of her car. And she did not come back. I want to be careful here because I've caught myself more than once constructing a narrative around the physical details of how these vehicles were found. And I'm aware that doing so is a form of interpretation, not analysis. Vehicles get abandoned in strange configurations for a lot of reasons. People have medical events. People make impulsive decisions. People accept rides. The open door and the running engine could mean a dozen things, and I can't prove what they mean. What I can say is that the detail of the beverages, the warm coffee in Purcell's truck, the cold coffee in Niminen's car, keeps putting me in the middle of a very compressed timeline. And that compressed timeline is difficult to resolve. The third case I spent significant time on was not from Nebraska. It was from Oklahoma, from the Route 83 segment I'd pulled in December. Warren Thibodeau, 67 years old, retired from Perryton, Texas. He disappeared in March of 2020. He'd been fishing near Optima Lake in the Oklahoma Panhandle and was driving home on Route 83 south. His wife reported him missing when he hadn't arrived by evening and wasn't answering his phone. His truck, a 2009 Ford F-250, white Texas plates, was found on Route 83 approximately 30 miles north of Woodward, Oklahoma, parked in a gravel turnout that appeared to have once been a service area for a gas station that had closed years before. There was a weathered concrete pad and an old pump island with no equipment on it. The truck was parked facing south. The engine was off. The doors were closed and locked. His fishing gear was in the bed. His wallet was inside the cab. His fishing gear was in the bed. His wallet was inside the cab. His phone was inside the cab. Battery dead. The keys were not found. Not in the ignition. Not in his pocket. His jacket, containing his phone and his wallet, was on the passenger seat. But his pockets were not searched because he wasn't there. Not on the ground near the truck. Not in the gravel. The trooper who filed the welfare check noted no keys located, doors secured in the incident log, and the notation appears in the missing persons case file as an anomaly that investigators intended to follow up on. I don't have any record of that follow-up producing an explanation, a locked truck with no keys. I've tried to work backwards from that. You can lock a car from the outside with the key fob and then be holding the keys when you walk away, which would mean he walked away with his keys but without his wallet and his dead phone. That's possible. That's a sequence of events that could happen. But it's a strange set of priorities. Take the keys, leave everything else, and the truck being locked at all is odd. Because if you're stopping on the shoulder of a rural Oklahoma highway in the middle of nowhere, locking your truck is not a reflex. You lock your car in a parking lot. You don't lock it in a gravel turnout on the highway where the nearest building is 6 miles away. I keep coming back to that locked truck. I keep coming back to it because it implies a different kind of departure than the other cases. Purcell's and Niminen's vehicles suggest abrupt, unplanned stops. Thibodeau's vehicle suggests something more deliberate, as if he got out of the truck, took his keys, and locked it behind himself. As if he intended to return, or as if he was following an instruction. I don't know which of those is true. I don't know if either of them is true. I'm just describing what the evidence implies, and I'm flagging my own uncertainty. Now I need to tell you about the truck. This is the part where the story stopped feeling like a data problem to me, and started feeling like something else. I was working through the Kansas cases, trying to match welfare check initiations to public missing persons records, when I pulled the supplementary case file for a woman named Reina Castillo Aguirre, 31 years old. She worked at a processing facility in Dodge City and disappeared in October of 2019. Her car, a 2011 Honda Civic, white Kansas plates, was found 9 miles north of Liberal, Kansas on Route 83, East Shoulder. The rear left tire was flat. A car jack was on the ground next to the wheel, positioned for use. The spare was in the trunk, untouched. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her phone was not found. The supplementary file contained interview summaries from tip-line callers who'd driven that section of Route 83 on the day she disappeared. 4 calls. 3 of them were general observations, nothing specific. The 4th was from a long-haul driver identified in the file as D. Marek. He said he'd been southbound on 83 that afternoon and had passed a vehicle on the shoulder approximately 3 miles north of where Castillo Aguirre's car was found. He described it as a white full-size pickup truck, American make, parked facing south on the northbound shoulder, meaning it was facing against the direction of its own lane. He noted a man standing near the front of the truck, facing the road, watching traffic, and he described something in the truck bed, a metal frame mounted toward the cab, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, standing vertically. He said it reminded him of the survey rigs he'd seen on pipeline assessment jobs, the kind of equipment that holds a sensor, or a camera, or a ranging instrument at a fixed elevation. A white, full-size pickup. A standing metal frame in the bed. A man watching traffic from the shoulder, 3 miles from a location where a woman had vanished next to a flat tire she never finished changing. I found that detail away and looked at it for a few days before I went back to the Nebraska cases. And in the tip documentation for Dale Purcell's case, I found this in a file I'd requested from the Holt County Sheriff's Office. There was a single tip submitted by mail, not by phone, from someone who gave no name or contact information. It was handwritten on plain white paper, and the text said, approximately, the writer had been driving north on Route 83 on the afternoon in question, and had seen a white full-size pickup parked on the west shoulder, about 2 miles north of where Purcell's truck was later found. The tip described something in the bed of the truck, described as a post and frame setup. It described a person standing outside the truck near the road. The file notation on that tip read, anonymous, no contact info, low evidentiary value. White pickup, standing frame or rig in the bed, person positioned roadside watching traffic. Nebraska case, Kansas case, 15 months apart. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the most reasonable explanations. Survey crews operate along highway corridors. Utility assessment teams do. Pipeline workers. Agricultural consultants. There are many legitimate reasons for a person to be parked on a rural highway shoulder with equipment in their truck bed. Being parked on a shoulder is not by itself alarming. Watching traffic while parked on a highway shoulder is not by itself alarming. And a tip from 2 unconnected witnesses in 2 different states over a 15-month span could be, probably is, coincidence. But the descriptions match. They match specifically enough that I can't fully dismiss them, and they're positioned near enough to 2 separate disappearances that I can't fully ignore them either. I've been unable to find any permit records, maintenance logs, or survey project documentation that would account for a white pickup with a frame mount operating repeatedly along the Route 83 corridor in 2019 and 2020. I made a public records request to both NDOT in Nebraska and KDOT in Kansas, asking whether any contracted survey or assessment crews had been operating along Route 83 in those periods. I got responses that covered general maintenance contractor schedules and found nothing that described a white pickup with that kind of equipment in either period. That absence is not itself evidence of anything. Contractors operate without always appearing in state records. Private landowners do survey work. Any number of explanations exist. But I've noted it. Around this time, this was February or March of 2023, I found something in Brooke Niemanin's Facebook profile that I want to describe carefully. Her profile was still public, still accessible, still populated with posts from the year before she disappeared. She had a habit of photographing her drives. She posted photographs from Route 83 in July of 2019, about 6 weeks before she disappeared. A series of road shots, the horizon, a grain elevator, the sky. Phone photos slightly blurred. One of them, in the lower right corner of the frame, showed a roadside post, not a standard green highway sign. A white post, shorter than a mile marker, with a number stenciled on it in black. The image was not sharp enough to read the full number with certainty. but it looked like 441, possibly with additional digits cut off by the frame edge. I noted it and did nothing with it for about a week. Then, while I was reviewing photographs that Warren Thibodeau's wife had posted during a visit to the location where his truck was found, she'd been to the site several times and documented it on the Facebook group for his case. I saw another one, behind the truck, partly visible, one of the same white posts. Better image quality in this one. The number was 337. 2 different states. 2 different sections of Route 83, hundreds of miles apart. Same post style, same stencil format, same isolated 3-digit numbers. I spent an afternoon trying to find official documentation for those posts. Nebraska's official reference marker system uses an alphanumeric format, R80RE 221 or similar, not standalone 3-digit numbers. I could not find any public documentation of a white post marker system using 3-digit stenciled numbers along Route 83 in Nebraska or Oklahoma. I filed a records request with NDOR asking about non-standard marker infrastructure in the relevant counties. The response, which came about 6 weeks later, said the department had no record of non-standard marker posts in those counties, and that any posts matching my description may have been placed by private landowners, utility companies, or other entities outside department jurisdiction. May have been placed, not were placed by, not we have no record of. May have been placed by entities outside department jurisdiction. I have that response in a folder on my desk. I've reread it probably a dozen times. I can't explain why it bothers me as much as it does. The language is standard bureaucratic hedging. It doesn't mean anything specific. But the combination of 2 independent marker sightings along the same corridor, both at sites associated with disappearances, with no official explanation for their origin, stopped feeling like a relevant detail and started feeling like something I needed to account for. I want to step back from the case specifics for a moment and talk about something I did in August of 2022, 2 months before I found any of this. I drove Route 83. I drove it for work. I had a site visit in North Platte, Nebraska, and instead of backtracking to the interstate, I drove south on 83 to Dodge City, Kansas, because it was a clear day and I wanted the quieter road. I've driven the sandhills before and I find them genuinely calming. Long grass, wide sky, very little traffic. I was in no hurry. I made good time. I want to be specific about the gap in my memory of that drive, because I've thought about it a great deal. Between North Platte and McCook, Nebraska, roughly 90 miles of Route 83 through the southern sandhills. I have almost no specific recollection. I remember leaving North Platte. I remember stopping for fuel at a gas station in McCook. I do not remember any specific moment of those 90 miles. I remember the sky being flat and white. I remember the road being straight. I do not remember a single landmark, a single other vehicle, a single thought I had during those 90 minutes. I know what highway hypnosis is. I know the brain economizes on low-stimulus repetitive tasks. I know that driving a straight, flat 2-lane road through featureless terrain in good weather is exactly the kind of task that produces memory economy. I know there is nothing unusual, medically or psychologically, about not remembering 90 miles of rural Nebraska highway. I know that. The reason I'm telling you about it now is that those 90 miles, that specific stretch of Route 83 south of North Platte, is where Dale Purcell's truck was found, 14 months before I drove through it. It's where, 18 miles further north, Brooke Nieminen's car had been found open and running in August of 2019, 3 years before my drive. I was moving through the same geography. I have no memory of it. I was just a person on a highway, and everything was fine. And I arrived in McCook and fueled up and drove on. I include that because it became relevant later. I'm going to come back to it. The map work is where this moved from a set of separate cases into something with a different shape. I'd been plotting the vehicle discovery sites on a physical map. I'd gone back to paper at some point, which I'll explain. And by March of 2023, I had 9 verified locations. Not just the cases I've described. 9 sites across the Route 83 corridor in Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma where a missing person case originated and where the vehicle had been found with keys present or nearby and owner absent, and no immediate explanation for the absence. 9 specific geographic points along a highway that runs roughly north to south through approximately 800 miles of mostly rural terrain. When I looked at those 9 points, they didn't distribute evenly. They clustered, 4 in a band between roughly the 42nd and 43rd parallels in Nebraska, in the southern Sandhills and around North Platte. 3 in a band near the Kansas-Oklahoma state line. 2 more, further apart, that didn't fit neatly into either cluster. I extended the central line through each cluster, treating each band not as a point but as a directional vector, and the 2 vectors did not run parallel. They were slightly angled relative to each other. If I extended them beyond their endpoints, they intersected. They intersected at a point on Route 83 in northwestern Kansas, in Decatur County, near the town of Oberlin, at approximately the 39th parallel. I am aware that 2 line segments drawn along the same highway will naturally converge somewhere along the highway. I've thought about the math on this, and the fact of convergence is not itself surprising. But I did the calculation twice and then a third time using a different method, and I kept arriving at the same intersection point, which was specific enough. Oberlin, Decatur County, 39th parallel. That I filed a public records request with the Decatur County Sheriff's Office, asking for their incident log data for welfare check initiations on Route 83 between 2018 and 2022. The response came in March of 2023. The log showed 2 welfare check initiations in that segment, both vehicle-related, both on Route 83. One from June 2019, one from October 2020. Both closed, unable to locate subject. The convergence point of my 2 line segments is a county that shows the same closure language as every other county in the dataset. I held that for several days before I wrote it down. I'm still holding parts of it. There's a case I haven't described that I found around this time, which introduced a different kind of texture to the whole pattern. A man named Curtis Elam, 44 years old, drove himself to a hospital in McCook, Nebraska in May of 2021. He was disoriented. He didn't know the date. He didn't know how he'd gotten to the hospital parking lot. His wife had reported him missing 4 days earlier after he left for a routine errand and didn't come back. His vehicle, a 2018 Toyota Tacoma red Nebraska plates, was found at a gas station on Route 83 in Atkinson, Nebraska, about 130 miles north of McCook, where security camera footage showed him pulling in, getting out, walking to the fuel pump, and then walking away from the pump without fueling. He walked north on the highway shoulder until he left the frame. The truck sat at the pump for 11 hours before the attendant called it in. Curtis Elam was medically evaluated at the hospital. He was physically unharmed, significantly dehydrated, and had no memory of the 4 days between walking north out of that gas station frame and waking up in his car in a hospital parking lot in McCook. The discharge documentation categorized it as a dissociative episode of unclear origin. His wife filed a follow-up report because she wasn't satisfied with that explanation, and that follow-up is what put the case in the county incident log system, where I eventually found it. He was not missing. He came back. He came back with no memory and no explanation and no physical harm, and the official record called it a dissociative episode and closed the file. His last confirmed location on camera, walking north on Route 83 from Atkinson, was approximately 8 miles from where Del Purcell's truck was found 14 months later. I'm not saying Curtis Elam's experience is evidence of what happened to Purcell or Niemanen or Thibodeau or anyone else on this list. I'm including it because the geography is specific, because the corridor is the same, and because it introduces a variable I hadn't previously considered, the possibility that the route through this corridor doesn't always end in complete absence. Sometimes it may end in return, with erasure. I want to talk about how agencies behaved, because that's the part that I have the hardest time rationalizing away. In the Facebook group for families of long-term missing persons, I joined it formally under my own name in the fall of 2022. There was a thread that had been active since April of 2021 that I want to describe. It was started by a woman whose brother-in-law had disappeared on Route 83 in North Dakota, which is the northern reach of the highway that I hadn't previously included in my analysis. The thread was not about a single case. It was about a shared experience among multiple family members. Their cases had been referred by county agencies to Kansas law enforcement at some point in the investigation. And after that referral, The cases had effectively stalled, not definitively closed, not definitively closed, not actively investigated, referred, and then quiet. This thread had contributions from the families of 2 Nebraska cases, the Oklahoma case connected to Thibodeau's, and a South Dakota case I hadn't previously found. All of them described the same experience. The county or state agency handling their case had told them at some point that the case was being coordinated with a law enforcement body in Kansas. None of them had received substantive communication after that referral. The cases were technically open. Nobody was working them. Now, cases get transferred. Coordination across state lines is routine and sometimes messy. Cases stall for resource reasons, for evidentiary dead ends, for 100 legitimate administrative reasons. I know that, but the specificity here, Kansas, consistently as the administrative location where case momentum disappears, was hard to set aside given that Kansas was also where my line vectors converged, and where I'd found the same closure language in Decatur County. In March of 2023, 2 weeks after I filed my records request with Decatur County, I received an email. I'll quote it directly because I kept a printed copy. It said, "I saw your records request to Decatur County. Please stop filing requests." That was the full text. There was no name, no agency affiliation, no explanation. The email address was a string of apparently random letters and numbers at a generic mail domain that no longer resolves when I try to access it now. I don't know who sent that email. I don't know how they knew I had filed a records request to Decatur County, although public records requests are themselves public records obtainable through subsequent requests, so the access is technically explainable. The speed of it, 2 weeks, is unusual but not impossible. The directness of it is harder to explain away. Please stop filing requests is not a spam message. It is not a mass communication. It is a message written to one person about a specific action that person took. I did not stop filing requests, but I started filing them differently, embedded in broader corridor requests, using different return addresses, asking about multiple highways at once so Route 83 would appear as one item among several rather than the obvious focus. And I started keeping paper files rather than digital ones. That shift happened around the same time. I can't fully justify it rationally. I can only say that the email made me want distance between my research and anything networked, and I felt more comfortable working in physical documents since then. There is one more case I want to mention before I get to what happened to me in April of 2023, and it's the case of Thomas Christ. His wife Sandra was one of the family members in the Facebook group I've described, and I've been talking with her for several months when she told me something she said she hadn't included in the original report because she didn't want investigators to get distracted. Thomas Christ disappeared on Route 83 in Nebraska in September of 2021. His truck was found 31 miles south of Ainsworth. Engine off, keys in the ignition, wallet and phone, keys in the ignition, wallet and phone on the seat, jacket on the seat, 62% battery on the phone. He had been driving the Ainsworth to Kearney route regularly for work, 2 or 3 times a month. In the weeks before he disappeared, he had mentioned to Sandra that he kept seeing the same white pickup truck when he drove that route. Not once, multiple times. Over several weeks, he described it as always being in roughly the same place, near a dry creek crossing about 20 miles north of North Platte. He said it had something in the bed, but he'd never slowed down enough to see it clearly. He mentioned it because he found it slightly odd. He didn't find it threatening. He just noticed it. Sandra said she hadn't told investigators because she was worried it would sound like she was constructing a narrative. She was worried they'd think she was a grieving wife who'd made her husband's disappearance into something bigger than it was. She didn't want to be that person. I told her she should tell them. I don't know if she did, but the white pickup truck on Route 83, near a dry creek crossing 20 miles north of North Platte, seen multiple times over several weeks. That is Thomas Christ's account, relayed through his wife, and the 20-mile radius from that creek crossing includes the discovery sites for both Dale Purcell's truck and Brooke Newman's car. All 3 connected to the same short stretch of highway in the southern Sandhills. All 3 with a white truck somewhere in the frame of the story. This is where I have to tell you about April of 2023, and I want to be precise because precision is the only thing I have. I received a work assignment in April of 2023, standard contracted work, nothing unusual, to conduct a corridor assessment on a section of Route 83 in Kansas, specifically between Colby and Oberlin, approximately 70 miles. The assignment came from my supervisor in a routine workflow email. There was nothing about the assignment that flagged itself as unusual. I accepted it the same day and began scheduling the site drive. I want to be clear that I was aware, by this point, that Oberlin was the convergence point of my map vectors. I want to be clear that I drove the assignment anyway, because it was my job, and because I had no legitimate professional reason to decline it. And because refusing a standard work assignment would require an explanation I couldn't give without disclosing 8 months of unauthorized use of my work access to investigate missing persons cases. I drove the segment on a grey afternoon in mid-April. I drove it with a kind of attention I had never previously brought to a professional site drive. I watched the shoulders. I watched every turnout and every access road. I watched every turnout and every access road. I watched for those white marker posts. I drove slowly enough that I probably looked strange to anyone behind me. I found nothing that I could point to and name. 70 miles of Route 83 in Decatur County, Kansas, under a gray sky, and I arrived in Oberlin, turned around, and drove back. I submitted my report. I drove home. I had dinner. I went to sleep. The next morning, I checked my phone's GPS log from the previous day out of habit. The drive was documented correctly. The route was correct. The timestamps were consistent in most places. There was a gap, 14 minutes, between 3047 and 4001 in the afternoon. During those 14 minutes, my phone's GPS recorded no position data. The track simply paused and resumed, as if the phone had been placed in a Faraday bag or had entered a dead zone severe enough to interrupt the GPS signal entirely. The positions on either side of the gap were coherent. I was still on Route 83, still moving, and the gap was the only evidence that anything had happened at all. The position where the gap began was approximately 8 miles north of Oberlin. I checked it on the map. 8 miles north of Oberlin, Decatur County, Kansas. The convergence point I calculated was approximately 6 to 9 miles north of Oberlin, depending on the method I used. I have a cellular dead zone in my GPS log from a field drive, centered on the same approximate location that my mapping analysis had flagged as a possible point of convergence. A cellular dead zone is a completely ordinary, completely explainable occurrence on a rural highway in western Kansas. I know that. I've driven routes that showed worse gaps than 14 minutes. The explanation for a GPS dropout in that location is probably just the topography and the carrier coverage. I have told myself that probably a lot of times the problem I can't resolve is the set of things that are individually explainable, that have now accumulated around a specific corridor of a specific highway. 14 missing persons cases with consistent vehicle abandonment patterns, across 5 states, across multiple independent administrative systems that share no institutional reason to produce the same results. Welfare check initiations closed with identical language by county agencies that don't share forms or training. 2 witness descriptions of the same white pickup with a mounted frame, separated by 15 months and 2 state lines. Y marker posts with standalone 3-digit numbers appearing at case-adjacent sites, with no official documentation of their placement. Case referrals that consistently terminate in Kansas. An anonymous email asking me to stop asking questions. And my own GPS producing a 14-minute gap in Decatur County. On a drive I remember completely, at a location I had already independently identified as significant. Individually, each of those things has an explanation. Collectively, they form something that I've spent 8 months trying to find a name for and haven't. I want to say something about Route 83 as a piece of infrastructure, because I think the choice of corridor, if it is a choice, and I'm genuinely not certain it is, makes a kind of operational sense that I can see clearly from my professional background. It is a highway that connects a sequence of nearly uninhabited places. It runs through counties that cover areas as large as Delaware or Rhode Island and have fewer residents than a mid-sized apartment building. The cellular infrastructure is a patchwork. The traffic cameras are sparse to non-existent outside of a handful of monitored intersections. The sheriff's departments are under-resourced and cover jurisdictions that require driving 40 or 50 miles to respond to a call. The administrative systems don't talk to each other. There is no single agency or individual whose job it is to look at Route 83 as a whole, as one continuous corridor, because the highway doesn't work that way, institutionally. It is segmented into state and county jurisdictions that each manage their piece and don't, under normal circumstances, aggregate what they see. I got to look at it as a whole because I was doing infrastructure analysis, which required me to look across those administrative segments. I'm not sure anyone else has looked at it that way. I'm not sure anyone has been in a position to look at it that way and notice what I noticed. And that specificity of access, the narrow professional window that allowed me to see across the seams, has become something I think about at odd moments. In the Facebook group for families, there is a woman named Paula Delaney, whose son went missing on Route 83 in western North Dakota in July of 2020. He was 26 years old and was driving back from a camping trip. His car was found running on the shoulder with the passenger window down and his belongings inside. Paula Delaney has called, by her own account, 11 different agencies across 3 states to ask who is coordinating the investigation of his case. She has received 11 different answers. Some of those answers named agencies that, when she called them, said they had no record of her son's case. That's not the highway. That's just how fractured rural law enforcement infrastructure is. But the fractures and the highway coexist, and the highway seems to operate. If it is operating, and I'm still not willing to commit fully to that framing, in exactly the spaces the fractures create. I don't know what I'm describing. I want to be honest about that. I don't know if these cases are connected by a person or a group of people, or a methodology, or some combination of things I haven't found yet. I don't know what the marker posts are, or who put them there, or what the numbers mean. I don't know what the white pickup and its frame mount is being used for. I don't know whether the referral to Kansas is significant or administrative. I don't know who sent me that email. I know the pattern holds. I know that every time I've expected the next data point to break it, it hasn't. I know that the corridor is specific, the cases are real, the geography is consistent, and the administrative silence around it is not easily explained by coincidence alone. The cases are still open, all of them as far as I can determine. Dale Purcell, Brooke Nieminen, Warren Thibodeau, Raina Castillo-Aguirre, Thomas Christ, Eli Brandt, the others I've found, and the others I suspect exist in logs I haven't accessed. Open cases on a highway that sees a few hundred cars a day through its emptiest stretches. Most of them traveling for completely ordinary reasons. Most of them arriving exactly where they intended to go. Most of them with no memory of anything unusual. Because nothing unusual happened to them, most of them. The last thing I want to say is about the drive I took in August of 2022. Before any of this, the 90 miles I don't remember between North Platte and McCook. I've thought about whether to include this, and I've decided to include it because leaving it out would be a kind of dishonesty that I'm not comfortable with. At some point during those 90 miles, I drove past the location where Dale Purcell's truck had been found 2 years earlier. I drove past the county road turnoff near the irrigation rig. I drove through the stretch of highway where Brooke Nieminen's car had sat with the door open and the engine running 3 years before that. I drove through all of it without knowing any of it, without any reason to notice any of it, and I arrived safely in McCook and fueled my car and drove on. And I don't remember any of it. If there is something operating in that corridor, something with rules, something consistent enough to leave the same signatures across 14 cases in 5 states in 3 years, then I drove through it. I was inside it, whatever it is, for 90 minutes on an overcast day in August, and nothing happened to me. And I can either conclude that nothing happened to me because the pattern is not what I think it is, or I can sit with the other possibility, which is that whatever I drove through on Route 83 that August, it let me pass without incident. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that it is the kind of framing that makes a reasonable person put down this document and go find something else to think about. I would have done the same thing 6 months ago. The folder on my desk has 14 names in it. The marker posts are still out there, unaccounted for, holding numbers that no official documentation explains. Route 83 is open right now. People are on it tonight. They're driving through the sandhills in the dark, through the dead zones in western Kansas, through the Oklahoma panhandle where the sky gets very big and the road gets very empty. They're making time. They're running a little late. They're drinking coffee that's getting cold, and their phones are in the cuff holder, and the shoulder of the road is dark in both directions, and they are not thinking about any of this. I'm not sure anymore whether that's the safe condition or the dangerous one.